The story I'm about to tell you begins with a document, brittle, yellowed, and hidden deep in the Louisiana State Archives. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a marriage certificate, the kind of fragile paper historians lock away behind glass. But if you read the names, if you let your eyes settle on the signature of Jeremiah Aldrich, the plantation master, and then slide down to the word Celeste, written not as a wife, but as property, you'll feel it. The chill of something that was never meant to be uncovered. Because beneath the ink of that certificate lies a wager, a humiliation turned binding contract, and the dark cascade of 13 deaths that followed. A bet, that's all it was supposed to be. A cruel joke among planters who had long grown bored with their own wealth, their own violence, their own dominion over human lives. Jeremiah Aldrich, the son of a failed farmer, was desperate to prove himself among the Louisiana aristocracy, and when his drinking companions sneered at the heavy-set enslaved cook who served their meals, Celeste, a woman they mocked with every vile word they could summon, Aldrich made a decision that would damn him. He vowed on the honor of his name that he would marry her. Not out of love, not out of rebellion, but to show that his power, his arrogance extended even over the most sacred human bond. Marriage itself would be his weapon. What the men at that table didn't realize, what Jeremiah himself could not comprehend, was that this joke would awaken forces that no plantation master could control. Within months of that grotesque union, Willowbrook Plantation became a graveyard. First, a stable boy found drowned in a trough. Then, a foreman's throat opened in his sleep, a guest poisoned after a lavish supper. One by one, the people closest to Aldrich fell, 13 deaths in less than a year. And though the official records chalked it up to accidents, fever, and bad luck, the private diaries and whispered accounts tell another story. A story of vengeance, of hidden hands pulling strings, of a woman who was never meant to be underestimated. But before we descend into the blood-soaked truth of what happened at Willowbrook, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments. Because this isn't just a tale about the 1850s, this is about power, who wields it, who suffers under it, and what happens when the oppressed find a way to strike back. Every empire has cracks, and in those cracks, the seeds of destruction take root. Now let's go back. Back 15 years before the marriage, back to the swamps and backrooms where Jeremiah Aldrich clawed his way out of obscurity and into wealth, corruption, and betrayal. Because to understand how a bet turned into a curse, you must first understand the man who thought he could own everything, and the enemies he made long before Celeste ever wore that ring. Jeremiah Aldrich wasn't born into Louisiana's aristocracy. He wasn't born into silk suits, French tutors, or sprawling plantations. He came from the dust and hunger of a failed tobacco farm in Kentucky, a place where his father drank himself to ruin and his mother whispered scripture over empty cupboards. By the time Jeremiah was 18, there was nothing left for him in that hollow patch of land but shame. So he did what so many broken men do. He ran. South toward New Orleans, where fortune was said to flow thicker than the Mississippi itself. He arrived in 1839 with little more than a cheap coat, a gambler's smile, and an appetite for power that could never be filled. The Creole families of Louisiana looked down on him. Their bloodlines were older, their estates grander, their manners polished to a fine cruelty he could never mimic. But Jeremiah possessed something far more dangerous than refinement. He had no conscience. And men with no conscience have a way of clawing up faster than those shackled by honor. It was in the sweltering summer of 1840 that Jeremiah formed his first true partnership with Marcus Devo, the desperate son of a decaying sugar dynasty, and Samuel Rochelle, a ship captain turned pauper by fever and debt. Together, the three men found the one business where desperation, cruelty, and greed met in perfect alignment: the trade of human lives. Though the transatlantic trade had been outlawed, loopholes and shadows still fed the market. Escaped slaves recaptured by bounty hunters, free black men kidnapped in the night and sold back into bondage, smuggled captives still slipping through from the Caribbean, their chains hidden beneath tarps of sugar and rum. Aldrich and his partners didn't bother with the respectable gloss that Creole traders used to cover their blood-stained dealings. They called their enterprise the Delta Trading Company, but in raw reality, it was an underworld cartel of flesh. The profits were staggering. In just 3 years, the trio turned broken bodies into fortunes. Marcus saved his family's plantation, turning creditors into allies. Rochelle bought a fleet of riverboats, rising again as a shipping magnate. And Aldrich, always the hungriest of them, purchased Willowbrook, a cotton plantation north of New Orleans, complete with its columned mansion, wide verandas, and hundreds of acres that shouted legitimacy to the world. But legitimacy is a mask, and masks eventually slip. By 1843, federal marshals had begun sniffing around the Gulf, tracing whispers of illegal shipments and corrupted officials. Fear crept into the partnership. Devo suggested dissolving the company and burning the ledgers. Rochelle, ever the pragmatist, proposed shifting assets offshore, waiting out the storm. But Jeremiah had another plan. Murder. He decided that very spring to kill them both, Devo and Rochelle, so that the empire would belong to him alone. The coldness of it was staggering. He staged the meeting in a warehouse destined for demolition, brought whiskey and ledgers as props, and hid a pistol in his coat, a knife in his boot. The story, later polished for police and newspapers, would be simple. 2 partners killed each other in a dispute over missing money. He, the survivor, was only lucky enough to escape with his life. The night unfolded in blood. Devo dropped first, 1 bullet to the chest, eyes wide in betrayal. Rochelle fought harder. He left a scar carved across Jeremiah's cheek, a permanent mark of resistance etched into the murderer's skin. But age failed him, and Aldrich's knife found its way to his heart. The sailor's dying words would haunt Jeremiah for years. "My son knows everything. He'll come for you." Of course, Jeremiah laughed it off, but he should not have, because when you kill me, and who still have sons, when you bury your crimes beneath lies, you are planting seeds you cannot control. That was the night Jeremiah Aldrich stopped being a man trying to climb Louisiana's ladder and became something else entirely, a predator who believed he had beaten the system. But the system has a memory, and the families he left in ruin would not forget. In the days after the warehouse murders of 1843, Jeremiah Aldrich walked the streets of New Orleans with a fresh scar across his face and the swagger of a survivor. The official story was sealed in ink. 2 men, partners in business, destroyed by their own greed. Jeremiah, the lone witness, too honorable to flee, too lucky to die. That scar became his alibi, a physical token of supposed innocence, and society, hungry always for a clean narrative, accepted it. The police, overworked and corrupt, closed the file within a week. The warehouse was demolished, taking with it ledgers, blood, and every damning scrap of evidence. The false witnesses Jeremiah had hired testified dutifully about overheard arguments, about bottles of whiskey and missing money. No one looked deeper. Why would they? The city had no appetite for probing into the dealings of men with plantations and bank accounts. Truth was expensive, and no one was willing to pay for it. So Jeremiah emerged not as a suspect, but as a respectable planter who had endured tragedy. He presented carefully forged documents showing that his partners had signed over their stakes in the Delta Trading Company to him in the event of their deaths. Banks, once cautious, now embraced him. Merchants extended credit. Politicians shook his hand. Overnight he had the appearance of legitimacy, as though he had never trafficked in chains and screams, only in cotton and sugar. Willowbrook became his stage. The plantation mansion, built in imitation of Creole grandeur, stood as proof of his ascension. Its sweeping verandas hosted gentlemen's gatherings, its dining hall echoed with drunken laughter, its fields, filled with enslaved laborers, fattened his coffers. Jeremiah relished it all. To the public, he was no longer the ragged Kentuckian chasing scraps. He was Aldrich of Willowbrook, a man to be invited, respected, even feared. But behind the curtain, shadows gathered. Marcus Devo's younger brother, Philippe, was not fooled. He knew his brother too well to believe the official story. Marcus had been many things, desperate, reckless, but not suicidal enough to brawl with Rochelle over money that had already been hidden away weeks before. Philippe began his own quiet investigation. He bribed dock workers, studied shipping manifests, and pieced together fragments of what Jeremiah had erased. He found lies in the testimony, cracks in the timeline, whispers of money withdrawn within hours of the murders. Piece by piece, the mask began to splinter. At the same time, Rochelle's son, Henri, was watching from another angle. At only 17, when his father died, Henri inherited not land or wealth, but something more dangerous: knowledge. His father had taught him how to read the invisible ink of commerce, bank ledgers, shipping routes, notarized deeds. Where Philippe was a hunter moving in the shadows of the docks, Henri was a surgeon dissecting numbers in quiet back rooms, and what he uncovered chilled him. Jeremiah Aldrich had stolen not just money, but entire businesses, siphoning accounts with the precision of a thief who had planned it all long before the first shot was fired. By 1845, the two men, Philippe and Henri, met in secret, one carrying the fury of blood revenge, the other armed with the cold logic of finance. And together they made a pact. Jeremiah Aldrich would not die quickly. He would not be shot in the street or stabbed in the night. That would be too merciful. No, their vengeance would be drawn out, methodical, poetic. They would dismantle him exactly as he had dismantled their families, through betrayal, manipulation, and the slow tightening of a noose he would never see until it was too late. Meanwhile, Jeremiah enjoyed his triumph, oblivious. He wore fine coats, dined with congressmen, and boasted of Willowbrook's expansion. But every glass he raised, every handshake he offered was haunted by unseen eyes. Philippe and Henri were already inside his world, studying his weaknesses, taking notes. And this is where the story darkens further, because while Jeremiah thought he was finally secure, fate was already winding the rope. His enemies were patient, and true vengeance takes time. By the late 1840s, Jeremiah Aldrich stood tall among Louisiana's planter class, but the truth beneath the marble facade was already rotting. Wealth, after all, is never enough for men like him. He had clawed his way into legitimacy through lies and blood, but legitimacy alone could not satisfy the hunger in his chest. He wanted not just riches, but respect. He wanted to sit at the tables of the oldest Creole dynasties, to be toasted as an equal among men whose families had owned land and power for centuries, and respect, in the Louisiana of that era, was bought not just with cotton and coin, but with displays of dominance. Jeremiah displayed his dominance recklessly. He gambled in the gentlemen's clubs of New Orleans, wagering sums that would bankrupt smaller planters. He drank like a man possessed, bellowing crude jokes in rooms where elegance was demanded. He took risks with his businesses, pouring money into schemes that yielded short-term profits but carried long-term ruin. And while his scarred cheek lent him an aura of danger that fascinated some, the true aristocracy whispered behind his back. They called him the Kentuckian Butcher. They laughed at his lack of refinement. They tolerated him, but he would never truly belong. It was during one of those long nights of cards and whiskey, sometime around 1852, that the fatal wager was born. Surrounded by men who mocked him, Jeremiah sought a way to silence their laughter once and for all. They had been making cruel sport of the enslaved people who served them, especially Celeste, the heavy-set cook at Willowbrook, a woman of remarkable skill in the kitchen, but derided endlessly for her appearance. Her size became their punchline, their way of reminding Jeremiah that no matter how many acres he owned, he could never polish himself into their world. The insults festered until Jeremiah snapped. He slammed his fist on the table and swore that he would do the unthinkable, marry her. Not as an act of kindness, not as rebellion against the system, but as a grotesque flex of power. He would turn their laughter into silence by taking what they mocked most and binding it to his name. To him, it was a game, a wager that would prove he could defy the codes of honor and still command fear. The men roared with approval, some laughing, others horrified, all eager to see if he would actually follow through. A bet was sealed, money placed on the table. Jeremiah, drunk and burning with arrogance, was trapped by his own pride. To back down would be humiliation, to proceed would be scandal, and so he chose scandal. But what Jeremiah failed to see was the larger board on which he had just placed his piece. For this bet was not simply about him and Celeste, it was about perception, power, and the thin line between dominance and destruction. In marrying her, he would not just mock the sanctity of marriage, he would expose himself to forces he could not control, forces that had been waiting for their moment. Because in the shadows, Philippe and Henri were still watching, and to them this marriage was not just an absurd spectacle, it was an opportunity. They saw cracks forming in Jeremiah's mask, debts mounting from gambling, whispers of ridicule spreading through high society, a dangerous wager that would make him vulnerable in ways he could not imagine, and Celeste herself, silent, observant, underestimated, would become the center of a storm no one, not even Jeremiah, could stop. The wedding was set for March of 1853. The certificate still exists, yellowed and brittle, with Jeremiah's name written in a bold, arrogant hand, and Celeste's name beneath it, labeled not as bride, but as property. It is perhaps the most damning artifact of that time, proof of a marriage that was never meant to honor, but to humiliate. What followed within months was blood. 13 deaths that turned Willowbrook into a house of whispers and terror, and though the papers called it coincidence, those who lived through it knew better. They whispered that a curse had been unleashed, that Jeremiah Aldrich, in binding Celeste to him, had bound himself to his own doom. But before the curse began to manifest, before the first bodies dropped, the wedding itself had to take place, and it was there, under the hot Louisiana sun, that the stage was set for one of the most grotesque spectacles the South had ever seen. March 1853, the day the wager came due. Willowbrook Plantation was dressed like a theater set, whitewashed columns polished, flowers dragged in from the fields, tables groaning with food prepared by the very enslaved hands who would not be allowed to taste it. To the aristocracy of Louisiana, this was not a wedding. It was a spectacle. Invitations had been whispered from gentleman's club to gentleman's club, not out of respect but curiosity. Could it be true? Would Jeremiah Aldrich actually go through with such madness? And so they came. Planters in fine coats, their wives wrapped in silks, their laughter sharp as knives. They came not to bless a union, but to gawk at it, to see if the Kentuckian butcher had truly lost his mind, to watch a man who wanted so desperately to be respected turn his own marriage into a circus act. Celeste was led out in a simple gown of white cotton, her hands trembling, her eyes downcast. The guests saw only what they wanted to see, a heavy-set cook, a figure of ridicule, the butt of a cruel joke. But those who looked closer noticed something else. In her silence, in the set of her jaw, there was no submission. There was only endurance, the kind of quiet endurance that holds more power than the loudest roar. Jeremiah stood tall at her side, his scar catching the light, his smile broad and poisonous. To him, this was victory. The crowd's jeers only confirmed it. He would not bow to their codes or their mockery. He would do what no one else dared, and in doing so, he believed he would rise above them. Power was not about honor, it was about audacity. And today, his audacity would be carved into history. The officiant read the vows, his voice stiff, unwilling, as though he could barely force the words past his lips. When Jeremiah signed the certificate, his pen slashed across the paper like a blade. Beneath his bold signature, Celeste's name, as written not as an equal, not even as a human, but as property transformed on paper into a wife. It was a grotesque alchemy, an official act of dehumanization sanctified by law. The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in laughter. Some clapped mockingly, others whispered scandal into their handkerchiefs, a few stormed away in outrage, muttering that such a union desecrated both marriage and social order. But most stayed, hungry to watch the farce play out. For them, it was entertainment, a rich man making a fool of himself, dragging a woman into the spotlight of their cruelty. But what none of them saw, or perhaps what they chose not to see, was the subtle shifting of the air around Willowbrook that day. For those who lived on the plantation, who had suffered under Jeremiah's rule, this was no joke. It was an opening, a fracture in the iron cage of power. In the kitchens and cabins, whispers passed from mouth to mouth. Something had changed. Something had been broken. Philippe and Henri were there too, mingling in the crowd, their eyes sharp, their silence calculated. To them, this was not just humiliation, it was leverage. Jeremiah had chained himself not only to Celeste, but to a scandal that could never be undone. The man who thought himself untouchable had given his enemies a weapon sharper than any knife. When the ceremony ended and the sun dipped below the horizon, the guests left with smirks and stories. But Willowbrook did not sleep that night. Its halls were heavy with unease, its walls seemed to breathe, and in the shadows of that plantation house, the first steps toward vengeance were already stirring. Because from that day forward, Jeremiah Aldrich was not just a man with enemies. He was a man cursed, by pride, by blood, and perhaps by something far older than either. In the weeks after the wedding, Jeremiah Aldrich discovered that respect, the thing he had gambled everything to claim, was slipping further away than ever. He had expected shock, perhaps scandal, but he believed that in time society would bow to his audacity. That was always his creed: act boldly enough, and people confuse arrogance for strength. But Louisiana's aristocracy did not bend. They whispered instead. In the parlors of New Orleans, ladies fanned themselves and spoke of Willowbrook with disgust. Gentlemen laughed behind brandy glasses, calling Jeremiah's union the kitchen marriage. Invitations to exclusive gatherings quietly ceased. His name was struck from guest lists. He remained tolerated in public spaces, yes, but no longer as an equal. He was entertainment now, a story traded like gossip over poker tables. The very thing he sought most, honor, was slipping through his scarred fingers. At Willowbrook itself, the atmosphere grew heavy, strange. The enslaved who had long suffered under Jeremiah's cruelty now watched him with new eyes. For years he had been untouchable, the master who stole, killed, and rose higher each time. But now they saw the laughter of the elites, cutting him down in ways no rebellion could. They saw him mocked, ridiculed, diminished. And in that humiliation, something shifted. His power no longer felt absolute. Celeste herself moved quietly through the halls, her expression unreadable. To the outside world she remained the cook, the object of mockery, forced into a grotesque role. But inside the plantation's quarters, her status changed overnight. She was no longer just a servant. She was the woman who had been bound legally and publicly to the master. For some it was a tragedy, for others a strange spark of possibility. Perhaps she could wield influence, perhaps through her justice could be whispered into action. Jeremiah, meanwhile, retreated deeper into his vices. The laughter of society cut at him worse than any blade. He drank heavily, gambled harder, seeking to drown out the ridicule. But debts began to mount. His cotton profits, once carefully reinvested, were bled into card games and whiskey debts. The Willowbrook accounts grew fragile, leveraged against loans he never intended to repay. For a man obsessed with control, he was slipping, though he refused to admit it. And in the shadows, Philippe and Henri were watching. Every misstep was a gift. They tracked his debts, his lost invitations, his public humiliations. Philippe moved closer still, appearing in Jeremiah's social orbit as though by chance, sharing drinks, offering sympathy, positioning himself as a friend. Henri dissected the ledgers, quietly tracing Jeremiah's decline. To them, the wedding was not merely scandal, it was the crack they had been waiting for. Then came the first death. A stable boy, barely 14, found face down in a water trough one morning. The overseers called it an accident. Children, they said, were careless, and the boy must have slipped. But those who saw the body whispered otherwise. The bruises on his neck did not match the story. Jeremiah raged at the carelessness of his staff, punishing men at random, but something in his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. For the first time in years, he was not certain he controlled his own house. In the quarters, the whispers grew bolder. 13 deaths, they would say later. But this was the first, the beginning of something no one could stop. Some claimed it was Celeste herself, enacting vengeance in silence. Others believed Philippe and Henri had planted their knives within the household. Still others said it was the curse, the inevitable consequence of mocking the sacred bonds of marriage, of reducing a woman to property even in union. Whatever teamin, truth, one thing was certain, the walls of Willowbrook had begun to bleed, and Jeremiah Aldrich, though he strutted and roared, was no longer master of his fate. The second death came less than a month later. A field hand, strong as an ox and in the prime of his years, collapsed while hauling cotton. His body was rigid, his mouth foaming, his eyes wide in terror as though he had seen something unspeakable in his final moments. The overseers muttered about sunstroke, though the day had been cool. Others said poison. Jeremiah raged, demanding answers, but no explanation satisfied him. 2 deaths so close together? Coincidence felt thin. Then a third. A housemaid, barely 20, found at dawn slumped across the kitchen table where she had been preparing dough. Her skin was grey, her lips blackened. By midday, the kitchen was scoured and her body buried in a shallow grave outside the quarters, as though erasure could cleanse the unease that now seeped through every corridor of Willowbrook. By the time the fourth came, a driver trampled under his own wagon horses in broad daylight. No one dared call it chance. Something was moving, unseen but certain. The enslaved spoke of it first. Whispers carried through the cabins at night, soft as breath. The curse has begun. They remembered the wedding not as a farce but as a rupture in the natural order. Jeremiah had mocked not just society but the bonds between flesh and spirit. To many, the deaths were not punishment of the weak, but the slow unraveling of the master himself. Each body was a message, written in suffering. Among the planters and aristocrats, the story took another shape. Jeremiah's enemies fanned the flames with careful precision. At salons in New Orleans, men spoke of Willowbrook as a place touched by misfortune, a house where fate itself seemed hostile. Henri Rochelle, subtle as ever, suggested in quiet conversation that debts and curses often traveled together. Philippe, louder and cruder, joked at taverns that perhaps Aldrich had married not a woman, but a hex, the T-Hubdin. Alice spread like smoke. Jeremiah, for his part, refused to acknowledge weakness. He buried the dead quickly, punished those who spoke too freely, and threw more money into card tables and brandy to prove he remained untouchable. Yet inside Willowbrook the truth was plain. He was rattled. His eyes flickered toward shadows in empty rooms, his temper lashed out at nothing, his hands shook when he believed no one was watching. Celeste endured it all in silence. She cooked his meals, tended the house, absorbed the scorn of guests who still came to gawk. Yet more and more the enslaved began to watch her with reverence. They believed she carried something within her now, a patience, a waiting. She did not speak of curses or vengeance, but she did not need to. Her presence itself seemed to thrum with a quiet inevitability. By the year's end, 4 deaths had become 6. A fever that took no one else claimed 2 brothers in the fields. Jeremiah ordered their cabin burned, declaring it pestilence, but no other illness spread. And when the ashes cooled, the whispers only deepened. 6 lives gone in less than a year. The number 13 had not yet been spoken aloud, but in Willowbrook's quarters, some swore they had seen it scratched faintly into a barn door one morning, as though carved by an invisible hand. The overseers scraped it away, yet the rumor lingered. 13. A count, a prophecy, and each death ticked the number closer. Philippe and Henri smiled behind their masks. For them, whether curse or coincidence mattered little. What mattered was that Jeremiah Aldrich's empire was cracking, and they were there to push at every fracture. And Jeremiah, he still believed himself master of the board. But the truth was dawning, slow and merciless. The game was no longer his to control. By 1854, Jeremiah Aldrich was a man unraveling in plain sight. The grandeur of Willowbrook still dazzled visitors. The great veranda, the chandeliers lit by whale oil, the fields stretching wide with cotton, but beneath the surface, rot gnawed at every beam. Debts piled higher than the harvests could sustain. The gambling tables in New Orleans drained him relentlessly. Each loss sent him chasing another hand, another bottle, another lie to himself that luck would turn. Bankers who once courted him now pressed for repayment. Merchants hesitated to extend credit. Rumors of insolvency, whispered in smoky back rooms, began to cling to his name. And then there were the deaths. Always the deaths. The seventh was a carpenter, found dangling from a rope in the barn. A suicide, the overseers said, but those who cut him down swore his hands were bound behind his back. The eighth, a child, trampled by oxen that had never once spooked before. The ninth, an overseer himself, bitten by a snake in his own bed, though no one could explain how the creature had gotten inside the house. Each death more absurd, more impossible to dismiss. Jeremiah raged at the absurdity. He punished the enslaved mercilessly, convinced they were plotting against him. He accused the overseers of incompetence, replaced them, and then replaced their replacements when they too failed to stem the tide. Yet the deaths continued, untouched by threats or violence. The more he lashed out, the more powerless he appeared. In the parlors of New Orleans, the whispers curdled into certainty. Willowbrook was cursed. Men crossed themselves when they spoke of it. Women said they would rather risk fever than step foot in its halls. The old families of Louisiana, who had once laughed at Jeremiah, now avoided him altogether. He was no longer a punchline but an omen, a man marked by something darker than ridicule. Philippe, Devo fanned the fire with crude relish. In taverns he claimed Willowbrook's walls bled at night, that shadows moved of their own accord. Henri Rochelle, careful as ever, offered subtler poison, a quiet word to a banker here, a suggestion of insolvency there. Together they wove a net of rumor and suspicion that left Jeremiah increasingly isolated. Inside Willowbrook, Celeste remained silent, watchful. Her role had shifted in ways Jeremiah could not name. The enslaved looked to her with a reverence that unsettled him. Meals tasted different now, sharper, heavier, as though she seasoned them with something beyond herbs. When she passed through the halls, conversations hushed. Jeremiah began to fear her gaze, though he could not admit it. To him, she was still just the cook he had humiliated into a wife, but to those who lived under his roof, she had become something else, a vessel of reckoning. By autumn, Jeremiah had taken to carrying pistols in every room. He drank himself to sleep and woke with a start at the faintest noise. He swore the mirrors in the house showed figures that vanished when he turned. He dismissed servants for imagined slights, then rehired them in confusion. His scar itched as though it burned anew. And still the count rose. 9 dead, 4 more yet to come. The number 13 loomed in every whisper, every candle-lit prayer, every restless dream. The curse, if curse it was, had not yet finished with him. And Jeremiah Aldrich, once a master of masks and schemes, was now a man reduced to waiting for the next blow, powerless to stop it. The winter of 1854 sank its claws into Willowbrook, not with frost, but with something colder. Jeremiah Aldrich paced his halls like a man already in the grave. His candlelight trembled against wallpaper stained from too many years of smoke and spilled brandy. The once proud master of Willowbrook had become a gaunt spectre in his own home, haunted not by guilt, he had buried that long ago, but by the unmistakable certainty that something, or someone, was dismantling his life, one corpse at a time. The 10th death was the most humiliating. A preacher from New Orleans, come to bless the plantation at Jeremiah's desperate request, collapsed mid-sermon, choking on his own blood. The congregation fled in terror. Some swore they saw Celeste in the back, her face expressionless as the holy man gasped his last. Jeremiah screamed that it was poison, demanded the preacher's body be cut open, but no cause was ever found. The 11th was an enslaved girl, no older than 16, who drowned in the ornamental pond. Her hands clawed at the stone rim as though she had been held under. Jeremiah ordered the pond drained and filled, convinced it was the work of spirits, but whispers spread that the land itself was reclaiming blood long overdue. The 12th was Jeremiah's most loyal overseer, struck down in the fields when his horse reared and snapped his neck. The animal, gentle for years, had bolted without warning at the sight of Celeste walking past with a basket of herbs. Jeremiah saw it himself, and in that moment something inside him cracked. He no longer shouted. He whispered, eyes darting to corners, hands twitching toward his pistol. Then came the 13th. A banker from New Orleans, one of the few still extending him credit, was found dead in his guest chamber at Willowbrook, his throat cut from ear to ear, his blood soaking the white sheets. No forced entry, no signs of sunning. Ruggle, only silence. Jeremiah locked every door, posted guards at every entrance, and accused the enslaved of murder, but no weapon was ever found, no footprints, no trace. The guests fled before dawn, and with their departure, Jeremiah's remaining credit fled with them. 13 dead. 13, the number whispered for months. 13, the mark of finality. The newspapers called it coincidence. The clergy called it God's wrath. But among the people of Louisiana, the truth spread in murmurs over whiskey and firelight. Jeremiah Aldrich was cursed, and the curse had found its completion. Yet Jeremiah did not feel release. He felt hunted. Every night he woke drenched in sweat, convinced that shadows pressed closer to his bed. He kept pistols on both nightstands, knives under his pillows, and still he dreamed of knives cutting through him. He heard footsteps in empty halls. He saw faces in windows that opened to nothing but dark fields. He drank until he could barely stand, then drank more to keep from sleeping. Meanwhile, Philippe, Devo, and Henri Rochelle watched from a distance, patient as ever. They had not lifted a hand to kill any of the 13. They had merely set the stage, whispered into the right ears, nudged fate with precision. The rest had been carried out by time, by fear, by the invisible hand of justice long deferred. Now, with Jeremiah's wealth collapsing and his mind fracturing, they prepared for the final act, the one that would not merely end Jeremiah Aldrich, but strip his name from the South forever. Jeremiah had no idea that the real torment had only just begun. Jeremiah Aldrich had barricaded himself inside Willowbrook like a king besieged. The once lavish plantation house now reeked of gunpowder, unwashed clothes, and stale brandy. Curtains were nailed shut, windows barred, doors chained from the inside. The master of the house no longer walked with swagger but shuffled with trembling steps, pistols clutched in both hands. The 13th death had not freed him. It had unmoored him completely. He spoke aloud to himself, muttering half prayers and half threats, insisting the devil himself had marked him. Servants fled one by one. Even the enslaved, too frightened to leave, kept their distance. Only Celeste remained constant, gliding through the halls with an eerie calm. Jeremiah could not decide if she was protector or executioner. When she placed food before him, he stared for hours before daring a bite. Yet somehow he could not stop eating. It was in this state of unraveling that Philippe Devo made his first open move. A letter arrived, sealed with black wax, bearing no name. Jeremiah slit it open with shaking hands and read words that froze his blood. Debt is not always paid in coin. Some debts demand flesh. We have waited. We are here. No signature, no explanation, only a mark at the bottom, a serpent swallowing its own tail. Jeremiah staggered back, the paper slipping from his fingers. He knew that symbol. He had seen it scrawled in the margins of ledgers from the Delta Trading Company, the secret code Philippe had once used to track their hidden shipments. The dead had returned. 2 nights later, Henri Rochelle arrived in New Orleans, not as an assassin but as a banker. He walked the cobbled streets in broad daylight, presenting forged documents and legal writs that revealed Jeremiah's staggering debts. Properties were seized, accounts frozen, Willowbrook itself placed under quiet review. Rumors of bankruptcy spray had faster than fire in cane fields. Men who had once sought Jeremiah's favor now crossed the street to avoid him. Philippe worked the other angle. He whispered to tavern keepers, to dockhands, to overseers who had fled Willowbrook. He painted Jeremiah not merely as cursed, but as a murderer who had betrayed his own partners for profit. His words spread like infection, retold with greater venom each time. By the end of the month, Jeremiah's name was spoken with disgust in places where once it had commanded grudging respect. But the real strike came not from rumor or law, but from presence. One storm-slashed evening, Jeremiah stumbled into his study, half drunk, only to find 2 figures waiting by the fire. Philippe, sharp-eyed and silent, and Henri, his father's features resurrected in younger flesh. For a heartbeat, Jeremiah thought he faced ghosts. His pistol slipped from his hand. "Did you think the dead would rest, Jeremiah?" Henri's voice was steady, measured, carrying the weight of 2 murdered fathers. Jeremiah stammered, tried to invoke law, God, anything that might shield him. But his words tangled in his throat. Philippe stepped closer, dropping a ledger onto the desk, a ledger Jeremiah recognized instantly. The coded accounts, the slave manifests, the proof of every crime. "You killed them," Philippe whispered. "But you did not kill the truth, and you did not kill us." Jeremiah lunged for the pistol on the floor, but Celeste appeared in the doorway, her massive frame filling it, her eyes steady and unblinking. She said nothing. She only stood, a silent witness. Jeremiah froze. For the first time he was truly cornered, by enemies from his past, by the wife he had mocked into marriage, and by the shadow of his own sins. This was no longer paranoia, this was judgment, standing in his own home, demanding payment in full. The storm outside raged like cannon fire, but the greater storm was within Willowbrook's walls. Jeremiah Aldrich stood trembling, his eyes darting between the two young men by the fire and Celeste's immovable silhouette in the doorway. His hands quivered, but not from cold. This was the shiver of a man realizing his predators had been in the room all along, watching, waiting, learning his every weakness. Philippe spoke first, his words precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "You killed my brother with a bullet in the chest. You killed his reputation with lies. But you left one thing behind, Jeremiah. You left the truth, and I've carried it here tonight." He opened the ledger again, running a finger down the ink-stained pages. Each line was a transaction, each mark a human life stolen, sold, or smuggled. Every number was a scar carved into memory. Jeremiah tried to look away, but Philippe snapped the book shut with a violence that made him flinch. Henri leaned forward, his voice low, almost conversational. "You think death would be your punishment? No, Jeremiah. Death is release. We came to give you something worse, to peel away the mask you wear before every man in Louisiana, to show the South what you really are." Jeremiah staggered back against the desk, clutching at its polished edge, as though wood could save him. "You have nothing," he hissed, though his voice cracked. "Nothing but lies. I am—" "You are finished," Henri interrupted, his calmness more terrifying than a shout. "Your creditors circle like vultures, your neighbors whisper of curses, and now—" He slid a packet of papers across the desk, each bearing the seal of the parish court. "Now, the law will feast on you. Forged wills, fake transfers, proof you murdered for profit, all tied neatly with your name." Jeremiah's face drained white. He tried to laugh, but it curdled into a cough. "Forgery!" he sputtered. You can't—" Philippe cut him off with venom. "We don't need courts to believe, Jeremiah. We only need them to want to believe, and they do. They hunger for your ruin. They will devour you because we have made it easy." Celeste moved then, stepping into the study. She carried nothing but the heavy silence that clung to her like armor. Jeremiah recoiled as though she held a blade. Henri looked at her with a strange reverence, as if acknowledging an ally in vengeance. "You thought her your joke," Henri said. "Your humiliation made flesh, but she has been your undoing. Every whisper, every fear, every death that hollowed you, she was the eye of it all. And still she stands, where you crumble." Jeremiah screamed then, not words but a raw animal sound. He hurled a glass at the fire, shattering it into sparks. He clawed at his scarred face, muttering of curses, of devils, of treachery. The two men did not move. They only watched, like hunters allowing the trapped beast to thrash itself against the cage. This was not the moment of the kill. This was the moment of breaking, the slow dismantling of Jeremiah Aldrich's mind, reputation, and power. Death would be too kind. They intended something far worse, to make him live stripped of everything he had stolen, exposed to a world that would mock him as he had mocked others. And so the torment began. The torment did not come as fire and steel. It came as whispers, papers, signatures, and the invisible machinery of society, grinding its gears against one man. Jeremiah Aldrich, once swaggering in his wealth, now stood at the center of a storm designed with surgical precision by Philippe Devo and Henri Rochelle. It began with the banks. Henri, armed with his forged documents and insider knowledge, spread rumors of unpaid loans and falsified collateral. Within weeks, creditors descended like a plague of locusts. Notices of seizure arrived daily, first a warehouse in New Orleans, then the riverboats he had invested in, then smaller parcels of land he had bought to extend Willowbrook's reach, each piece stripped away until Willowbrook alone remained, his grand plantation house, now a crumbling shell of a dying empire. But the financial ruin was only the first blow. Philippe ensured the second struck deeper into the marrow of reputation. Over bourbon and cigars in gentlemen's clubs, he planted tales of Jeremiah's duplicity. He spoke of missing ledgers, of partners murdered in disputes, of debts covered in blood. He did not need to prove it. Men of power already resented Jeremiah's rise from nothing. They wanted to believe he was a fraud, and Philippe gave them the permission to say it aloud. By spring of 1855, Jeremiah found doors closing to him. Men he once drank with refused his letters. Women whispered behind their fans when he entered ballrooms. Invitations ceased. Even the clergy avoided his pew, murmuring that no blessing could settle on Willowbrook's cursed ground. Then came the courts. Henri filed claims that Jeremiah's assets had been secured through fraudulent partnerships. Witnesses appeared, dockhands, clerks, men bribed or threatened into testifying that Jeremiah had stolen funds, forged signatures, even orchestrated disappearances. The weight of accusation mounted, impossible to escape. Though no jury yet condemned him, the stain clung like tar. And while all this unfolded in daylight, the nights became Jeremiah's true torture. For Celeste moved among the enslaved with a calm that mocked his panic. They obeyed her more than him now, their eyes drawn to her as though she carried some secret flame. Meals arrived late, cold, or strangely bitter. Doors creaked open at night, though he swore he had locked them. Candles guttered out without reason. He heard laughter in the halls, but when he pursued it, he found only silence. The deaths had ceased, but something worse had taken their place, the living conspiracy of perception. Every man, woman, and child on that land seemed part of a theatre staged against him, their gazes weaving a web of judgment from which there was no escape. One evening, drunk and desperate, Jeremiah stormed into town to demand respect from a tavern full of planters. But instead of deference, he was met with jeers. One man spat at his boots, another called him a murderer, a third laughed. "How many more partners must die for you to pay your debts, Aldrich?" Jeremiah drew his pistol in rage, but when he pulled the trigger, the gun misfired. The room erupted with laughter. He fled into the night, his name shredded beyond repair. By the summer, Jeremiah Aldrich was ruined. Wealth gone, honor gone, allies gone. Only Willowbrook remained, an empty husk of grandeur where the walls whispered with secrets and the air carried the weight of judgment. And in that ruin, Philippe and Henri waited, patient as ever, for the final strike. For they had not come merely to strip Jeremiah of possessions. They had come to strip him of self, to grind his soul into ash before letting him fall. By the autumn of 1855, Jeremiah Aldrich no longer resembled a man. He was a hollowed shell staggering through his own halls, muttering to shadows, clutching pistols that never seemed to fire when needed. His fine clothes hung loose from a body wasted by sleepless nights and drink. The plantation, once orderly, fell to chaos. Weeds swallowed the fields. The enslaved moved silently under Celeste's gaze, their obedience no longer directed toward the master, but toward the cook he had once mocked and shackled into marriage. It was not just poverty that broke Jeremiah, it was perception. Everywhere he looked he saw enemies. When the wind rattled shutters, he heard whispers of betrayal. When servants carried food, he swore it smelled of blood. His mirrors no longer reflected only his scarred face. They showed figures behind him, silent and watching. He smashed them all, but still, he claimed he saw eyes staring from the shards. Celeste's presence became unbearable. She no longer spoke to him, yet he felt her in every room. The scrape of her footsteps across the kitchen floor sounded to him like a death march. The simple act of her stirring a pot sent his mind reeling. He began to insist she was poisoning him, though he could not stop eating the food she placed before him. He grew gaunt, then bloated, then feverish, trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him. And in his nightmares, those were worse than the days. He dreamt of his murdered partners, Marcus Devo with his blood-soaked shirt, Rochelle clutching the knife in his gut. They stood at the foot of his bed, silent, eyes full of judgment. Behind them, he saw Henri and Philippe, their younger faces shining with the cold fire of vengeance. And always, always, Celeste, towering, faceless, a shadow pressing down on his chest until he woke gasping for air. The townsfolk whispered that Jeremiah had lost his mind, and perhaps he had. He wandered into the cane fields at night, firing pistols into the air, screaming at enemies no one else could see. He accused overseers of plotting his death, only to fall on his knees the next day, begging their loyalty. His scar throbbed with pain so sharp that he clawed at his own flesh until blood ran down his cheek. Philippe and Henri did not need to lift a hand. Their plan had worked too well. The weight of debt, rumor, and guilt had collapsed Jeremiah's mind into a labyrinth of fear from which there was no escape. And yet, they were not satisfied. Watching from the shadows, they understood that Jeremiah still clung to one thing: his name. However ruined, however mocked, Jeremiah Aldrich still bore the title of Plantation Master. It was the last mask he wore, the last illusion of control. That mask, they decided, must be torn away in public under the eyes of all who had once envied him. Only then would the ruin be complete. But fate itself seemed to play in their hands, for by the end of that year a scandal began to spread, rumors of Jeremiah's strange marriage to his enslaved cook, Celeste. At first whispered in disgust, it soon grew into laughter, then outrage. The planters of Louisiana did not forgive debts, but they forgave humiliation even less. And so Philippe and Henri set their trap, not with blades, but with gossip and exposure. They would drag Jeremiah into the light, force him to stand before society not as a master, not even as a man, but as the embodiment of his own degradation. The scandal did not burst forth all at once. It crept, sly as a snake through tall grass, whispered in taverns, repeated in parlors, exaggerated in salons. By the time it reached the newspapers, it had already grown teeth. Jeremiah Aldrich, master of Willowbrook, has taken as wife his own enslaved cook, one article snickered, written in the mocking tone of Southern satire. Another, less humorous, condemned him outright. Such perversions of station disgrace not merely one man, but the honor of our society. It mattered little that the marriage had been born of mockery, an act Jeremiah had meant as humiliation. What mattered was how it was seen. A proud planter, ruined and desperate, clinging to an enslaved woman as his last tether. In the twisted logic of Louisiana's social order, nothing could be more degrading. Philippe ensured the rumors spread with precision. He bribed printers to keep the story alive, feeding them embellished details. That Jeremiah dined each night at Celeste's table, that he bowed to her whims, that she held dominion over the plantation while he quivered in drink. Henri fanned the flames in court, weaving the marriage into the narrative of Jeremiah's fraud, painting him not just as criminal, but as aberration. By the spring of 1856, the scandal consumed every conversation. At balls, his name was hissed with laughter. In taverns, his fall was toasted with cheap whiskey. In churches, preachers invoked him as proof of society's decline. Jeremiah Aldrich, once feared and envied, had become a caricature, the butt of every cruel jest. The humiliation struck deeper than any financial loss. Jeremiah raged, smashing furniture, cursing Celeste as the devil in disguise. Yet in his rages he could not touch her. When he raised his hand, it trembled in the air, then fell back limp at his side. It was as though some unseen chain held him, and Celeste, calm as ever, only watched with eyes that gave nothing. At a planters' gathering he forced his way into, Jeremiah attempted to defend himself. Standing before men who once sought his favor, he declared, "She is nothing to me, a joke, a slave. Do you not see it was all in mockery?" But his words twisted against him. The crowd jeered, some laughing, some spitting. One shouted, "Then you are less than a man, Aldrich, mocked by your own house." The humiliation was complete. His enemies did not need to draw blood. Society itself had done it for them. Jeremiah Aldrich, who had clawed his way to power through cunning and cruelty, now stood exposed as a fool, a monster, and a laughingstock. For Philippe and Henri, this was nearly enough, but nearly was not the same as complete. They wanted him not just mocked, not just ruined, but destroyed, mind, body, and soul. And Celeste, silent as she was, seemed to want the same. By the summer of 1856, Jeremiah Aldrich was no longer mocked in whispers, he was mocked to his face. Boys spat at him in the street, former allies turned their backs. Even enslaved children at Willowbrook giggled behind his shadow, fearless now, emboldened by his decay. The master had become a clown in his own house. But Jeremiah was not a man to fade quietly. Humiliation bred fury, and fury bred violence. He stalked Willowbrook's halls at night, pistols in both hands, ranting at portraits of his ancestors. He raved that they had betrayed him, that they had cursed him with weakness. The scar on his face split open from constant scratching, oozing blood down his cheek like a perpetual wound. And always Celeste, silent, immovable Celeste. She served him meals, she moved through the halls, she met his rages with an unreadable stare that maddened him more than words ever could. He began to see her everywhere, in doorways, in mirrors, at the edge of his dreams. Sometimes she was real, sometimes she was not. But in his fractured mind, she was always there, a presence that would not release him. One night, in a fevered haze, Jeremiah staggered into the kitchen where Celeste stood over a pot of stew. His hand shook as he leveled a pistol at her. "You," he rasped, spittle flying from his cracked lips. "You've poisoned me. You've cursed me. You're the devil's bride, and I'll end you before you drag me to hell." Celeste did not flinch. She only turned, her towering frame casting a shadow that seemed to stretch far beyond the walls of the kitchen. Her gaze locked on his, calm, unblinking. Jeremiah's finger twitched on the trigger, but the pistol misfired with a hollow click. His scream of rage echoed through the halls as he hurled the weapon across the room. "Why won't you die?" he roared, falling to his knees. "Why won't you let me die?" But Celeste said nothing. She only returned to stirring the pot, the wooden spoon scraping against iron in a rhythm that matched the pounding of his skull. That night, Jeremiah's madness reached its peak. He tore through Willowbrook, smashing mirrors, slashing at curtains, firing shots into empty rooms. He shouted at invisible enemies, begged his murdered partners for forgiveness, cursed Henri and Philippe as demons risen from the grave. Finally, in a fit of exhaustion, he collapsed in the grand hall, sprawled among shattered glass and splintered wood, muttering like a child. Outside, Philippe and Henri watched from the edge of the fields. They did not enter. They did not need to. Jeremiah was already destroying himself. But they knew the time for patience was closing. Madness was not enough. A man could be mad and still dangerous, still lingering like a viper in tall grass. No, the end must come not in madness alone, but in finality. By autumn, the whispers had grown into accusations too loud to silence. Farmers, merchants, even local clergy began to speak openly of Jeremiah Aldrich's crimes. Livestock went missing, neighbors vanished, debts piled up unpaid, and at the center of every story was Willowbrook, a house that seemed cursed, a house where screams were heard at midnight and lights flickered without flame. Philippe and Henri had pulled the strings with meticulous precision. Old ledgers, thought destroyed, appeared in the hands of journalists. Depositions surfaced, implicating Jeremiah in slave smuggling, forgery, and murder. Anonymous letters reached the desks of judges, detailing the 1843 warehouse killings. Even the yellowed marriage certificate between Jeremiah and Celeste was leaked. A grotesque relic that painted him as both deviant and blasphemer in a society built on brittle codes of honor. The people of St. Charles Parish, who once tolerated Jeremiah for his wealth, now saw him as something worse than corrupt. They saw him as weak. And weakness was the one crime the South would never forgive. One night as he staggered drunkenly through the halls of Willowbrook, Jeremiah heard a pounding at his gates. Dozens of men with lanterns and muskets had gathered. Some were creditors, some were rivals, others were simply neighbors eager to see blood. They shouted his name, demanding he answer for his sins. Jeremiah lurched onto the balcony, wild-eyed and reeking of whiskey, his clothes stained with sweat. He screamed at them like a mad prophet. "You think you're men? You're cowards, all of you. You'd be nothing without me. I built this land with my own hands, and you, parasites, feast on what I made." But the mob only jeered. Stones struck the walls, a musket cracked, and a bullet shattered the balcony rail inches from his hand. For the first time, Jeremiah felt true fear, not of ghosts, no, not of curses, but of living men who had stripped him of all protection. Inside, Celeste stood at the window, watching silently. Philippe and Henri were in the crowd, their faces obscured by shadows, guiding the storm without stepping into its light. The sheriff arrived before blood was spilled, dispersing the mob with promises of justice, but the message was clear. Jeremiah's time was measured not in years or months, but in hours. Back inside, Jeremiah collapsed at Celeste's feet. "Help me," he begged, voice cracking like dry wood. "You're all I have left. Don't let them take me." Celeste tilted her head, studying the broken man who had once claimed to own her. For the first time she spoke, not with anger, not with fear, but with cold certainty. "They are not taking you," she said, her voice steady as stone. "You are giving yourself." Jeremiah's blood froze. He did not understand her words, not fully, but some part of him sensed their truth. The trap had closed. The end was no longer coming from outside. It was rising within him, inevitable as the grave. The dawn came grey and heavy, a sky swollen with storm. At Willowbrook, Jeremiah Aldrich awoke to the sound of boots on the porch. Not the mob this time, the law. The sheriff himself, flanked by deputies and a court clerk bearing writs with red seals. Jeremiah staggered to the door, half-dressed, pistol in hand, but when he pulled it open, he found no fear in their eyes. The deputies raised their rifles without hesitation, and the sheriff's voice cut through the humid morning like steel. "Jeremiah Aldrich, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and suspicion of murder." The words seemed to echo inside his skull. Murder, the one crime he thought buried, the one secret he believed had died with Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle, yet here it was, spoken aloud by the law itself. Neighbors gathered as the planter was dragged in chains through the streets. Women spat at him, children pointed and laughed. Men who once toasted him in clubs now turned away, ashamed they had ever shared his company. At the courthouse in New Orleans, the trial became the talk of the South. Crowds swarmed the steps, eager for a spectacle. Reporters scribbled furiously as witnesses took the stand. Dockhands, clerks, even enslaved men who had escaped Willowbrook. Piece by piece, the facade crumbled. Ledgers surfaced, signed in Jeremiah's own hand, detailing illegal slave shipments. Forged documents tied him to vanished investments. And then came the most damning testimony of all. Henri Rochelle himself, calm, articulate, describing in exquisite detail how Jeremiah had looted his murdered father's fortune. The courtroom gasped when Henri produced the yellowed marriage certificate. The clerk read aloud the words, "Jeremiah Aldrich, married to Celeste, property." A grotesque laugh rippled through the crowd. The judge banged his gavel furiously, but the stain could not be erased. Jeremiah rose, shouting, spittle flying, "She bewitched me. She was never my wife. She was my curse. You don't understand. None of you understand." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Some jeered, others crossed themselves as if in the presence of something unholy, and there at the back of the hall, Celeste stood silent, watching, always watching. The trial dragged for weeks, but the verdict was inevitable. Guilty. Stripped of property, stripped of dignity, Jeremiah Aldrich was sentenced not to death. Oh no, that would have been mercy. Instead, he was left destitute, marked as a pariah, and remanded to parish jail to rot while his estate was dismantled and auctioned off piece by piece. But Philippe and Henri knew the court's judgment was only the beginning. Justice on paper was fragile. Jeremiah still breathed, and as long as he drew breath, the risk remained. The jail was damp, the air thick with mildew and rot. Jeremiah Aldrich sat hunched on a splintered bench, his once grand clothes reduced to rags, his skin pale and scarred. He muttered constantly, a broken litany of excuses and curses. To the guards, he was a curiosity, a fallen lord, gnawing on scraps like a rat. But at night, the whispers came. In the silence between rattling chains and dripping water, Jeremiah swore he heard footsteps pacing outside his cell. A voice, low, steady, familiar, breathing his name. Sometimes he thought it was Henri, sometimes Philippe, and sometimes he was certain it was Celeste, her shadow stretching across the wall, though no fire burned. The jailers said he screamed in his sleep, clawing at the stone, begging for release. He swore the rats in the straw carried messages, that the walls themselves pulsed with judgment. By dawn, his eyes were wide and bloodshot, the look of a man already condemned by something deeper than law. One evening, the footsteps became real. 2 figures in black cloaks slipped past bribed guards and stood before his cell. Jeremiah rushed to the bars, clutching them with bloodied fingers. "Help me," he pleaded. "You know I was framed. You know she cursed me. Don't leave me here." But the men said nothing. They only watched, eyes glinting in torchlight. Then, slowly, deliberately, Philippe slid a folded parchment through the bars. Jeremiah unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a sketch, his own face, gaunt and ruined beneath the words, "The debt is paid." By morning, Jeremiah Aldrich was found hanging from his own belt. The guards called it suicide, but those who knew better whispered that justice had come, not by rope, but by design. The curse of Willowbrook was complete. When word spread that Jeremiah Aldrich had been found hanging in his cell, the South reacted with a mix of relief and dread. Some called it justice. Others whispered it was something darker, that no rope could strangle a man already claimed by the devil. At Willowbrook, Celeste remained. She did not flee, did not speak of what she had endured. She simply walked the halls as though she owned them. The auctions came, stripping the estate piece by piece, furniture hauled away, cotton fields parceled, slaves sold to neighboring plantations. But no one touched Celeste. Buyers avoided her, workers refused to approach. It was said her eyes carried the weight of death, and that anyone who tried to claim her would meet the same fate as Jeremiah. So she stayed, a solitary figure in the decaying mansion. She cooked meals no one ate, lit fires in empty hearths, sang low songs in a language no one recognized. Travelers passing on the river swore they saw her silhouette in the windows long after the estate should have been abandoned. Some said she was keeping vigil, others said she was binding the house with curses so Jeremiah's spirit would never rest. Philippe and Henri never spoke her name again. They had fulfilled their vow, but even they understood that Celeste was something beyond vengeance, beyond justice. She had survived not by accident, but by will. She had turned her chains into silence, and her silence into a weapon sharper than any blade. Years later, when the war came and the South burned, Willowbrook finally collapsed into ruin. But still, stories lingered of a woman in the kitchen window, stirring a pot that never boiled, watching with eyes that saw too much. Celeste was no longer a slave. She was legend. The tale of Jeremiah Aldrich did not end with his death. Legends rarely do. His name became a warning, whispered in parlors and taverns, the planter who married his slave, the fool who thought power meant ownership, the man who gambled with life itself and lost. Parents invoked his story to frighten their sons, preachers thundered against his sins, and newspapers used his downfall as proof that Providence still punished the wicked. But beneath the moralizing, another current flowed. Men who knew the truth, men like Philippe and Henri, spoke quietly of what had really destroyed him. Not the courts, not the mobs, not even their vengeance. No, Jeremiah Aldrich was undone by the very things he thought he could master: silence, memory, patience. Tools he dismissed as weakness became weapons in the hands of those he underestimated. And always there was Celeste. Her name barely appeared in the records, her voice absent from the testimony. Yet she was the constant presence, the unmoving figure who watched while others acted. To some she was victim, to others avenger. To the rest, something far more unsettling, a reminder that history does not always speak in the voices of the powerful. Sometimes it speaks in shadows, sometimes it speaks through silence. Walk through Louisiana today and you'll still hear her story told in fragments: a cook who cursed her master, a slave who outlived the South's cruelties, a woman whose silence broke a man louder than any bullet. And perhaps that is the truest lesson hidden in this tale. Power is never where men believe it lies. Jeremiah Aldrich built his world on chains, blood, and betrayal, but in the end, he died nameless, forgotten, while Celeste, mute, enduring, unclaimed, became eternal. Some stories do not end. They haunt.